cannibal town of Sawney Bean Real Horrors Uncovered. It always starts the same way. Late at night, silence thick in the air, the faint glow of a computer screen casting shadows across my cluttered desk. Outside, rain drummed softly against the window, and the distant rumble of thunder made the walls tremble ever so slightly. I should have gone to bed hours ago, but anyone who spent time diving into the darker corners of the internet knows how easy it is to lose track of time. That night, I was waist-deep in a forum buried far within the dark web, a place I won't name because honestly, no one should go there. It was a board dedicated to historical conspiracies, the kind of place where myths are dissected with surgical precision, where every urban legend has a thread. But one thread caught my eye amidst the sea of cryptic titles and grainy, "The Bean Clan lives" proof inside. I froze, my cursor hovering over the title. If you're familiar with the legend of Sawney Bean, you'd understand why. The story goes back centuries. Alexander Sawney Bean, the head of a monstrous family that lived hidden in a coastal cave in Scotland. They abducted travelers, feasted on their flesh, and reportedly consumed over 1,000 people before they were captured and executed. It's the stuff of nightmares. But they're supposed to be long dead. Curiosity is a double-edged sword, and that night, it cut deep. I clicked the thread. There wasn't a detailed post, no paragraphs of context or eerie speculation, just a single hyperlink displayed in plain text. Visit if you dare. I hesitated. Clicking random links on the dark web is an express lane to getting hacked, tracked, or worse. But something about this felt deliberate, like it was meant to be found. Against every ounce of logic, I clicked. My screen went black for a moment. Then a video feed flickered to life. It wasn't archived footage or some documentary clip. It was a live stream. The camera was pointed at the mouth of a cavern, framed by jagged stone and illuminated by the faint glow of what looked like an old lantern sitting just inside. The light barely cut through the inky blackness beyond the entrance, but faint movement caught my eye. Silhouettes. Shapes shifting just out of reach of the light. I leaned closer, squinting at the screen, trying to make out details. Were those people? Animals? The low hum of distorted audio crackled in my headphones. Static hissed, then subsided, and a voice, low, guttural, almost a growl, spoke through the speakers. They're still hungry, and they know you're watching. I ripped my headphones off, heart pounding in my chest. My first instinct was to close the tab, shut down my computer, and maybe even smash the thing into pieces. But my hand hovered over the mouse, my breath hitched, I couldn't look away. The figures in the cave seemed to inch closer to the camera, their movements unnatural, jerky, like puppets on strings. But then one of them stopped, just at the edge of the light, and turned toward the camera. Its face, I still can't describe it properly. Pale, hollow-eyed, mouth slightly open as if tasting the air. I slammed my laptop shut. For several minutes I just sat there, staring at the closed device as if it might start hissing at me again. My reflection in the dark screen was pale, eyes wide with fear. "It's just a prank," I whispered to myself. Some sick internet joke, but deep down I knew it wasn't. I paced my room for what felt like hours, running through every possible scenario in my mind. Maybe it was staged. Maybe it was just actors in a cave with a good camera. But that voice, the way it crawled into my ears and stayed there, it wasn't fake. When I finally opened my laptop again, the live stream window was gone. The forum thread had been deleted, replaced with a generic error 404 message. But my email inbox had a new message. "They're waiting. Coordinates attached." I stared at those words for what felt like an eternity. Attached was a string of GPS coordinates. I copied them into a mapping tool. They led to a remote spot on the Scottish coastline, near Benane Cave, the legendary home of the Bean Clan. I sat back in my chair, my heart racing as I stared at the blinking cursor on the screen. Every rational thought told me to leave it alone, to shut it all down and forget it ever happened. But curiosity, it's not just a curse, it's a disease. And I was already infected. The next thing I knew, I was booking a flight to Scotland. Sleep became impossible after that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that cave entrance, those shadowy figures shifting just beyond the light, and the hollow, lifeless face staring into the camera. Over the next few days, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an elaborate prank, a twisted art project, or some immersive horror experience. But the encrypted email in my inbox said otherwise. They never left, coordinates attached. It felt like bait, a hook specifically crafted for me. But whoever or whatever sent that email had me caught already. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The coordinates led to a remote section of the Scottish coastline not far from Benane Cave, the supposed home of Sawney Bean and his clan. I dove deep into online archives, historical texts, and old folklore forums. The story remained consistent across all sources. Sawney Bean, his wife, and their inbred clan of nearly 50 descendants lived hidden in the cave for decades. They ambushed travelers along lonely roads, dragged them back to their lair, and feasted on their flesh. It's said they preserved the remains using salt from the sea and consumed every part of their victims. But what bothered me weren't the facts. It was the inconsistencies. Reports from local historians mentioned strange disappearances continuing well into the 20th century, and there were scattered accounts of travelers still vanishing in that area to this day. Despite everything I'd read, I still told myself it was just research. I convinced myself I was chasing a story, something I could write about, publish, and move on from, but deep down I knew better. 2 days later, I booked a one-way ticket to Scotland. The flight was long and suffocating. I kept replaying the live stream in my head, the whispers in the speakers and the figures in the shadows. By the time I landed in Glasgow, I felt like I hadn't slept in weeks. From there, I rented a car and began the long drive to the coordinates. The further I drove, the more isolated the landscape became. Endless fields of windswept grass, jagged cliffs, and narrow roads barely wide enough for one car. I reached the village nearest to Benane Cave just as the sun was starting to set. It wasn't even on most modern maps. A handful of crooked cottages, a pub with peeling paint, and a tiny inn with faded curtains swaying in cracked windows. The village felt frozen in time. There were no children playing outside, no cars parked along the narrow streets. Just silence. The few people I did see stared at me from behind curtains or turned away as I passed. At the inn, a frail, elderly woman stood behind the desk. Her hands shook as she signed me into the guest book. She didn't make eye contact. "Are you here for hiking?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. I hesitated before answering, then nodded. Something like that. She didn't ask any more questions, just handed me a rusted room key and pointed to a narrow staircase leading to the upper floor. As I turned to leave, a rough, calloused hand grabbed my wrist. I spun around to see an elderly man, wiry, with sunken eyes and skin weathered like old leather. He'd appeared out of nowhere, moving silently despite his frail frame. "You shouldn't be here," he hissed, his grip tightening painfully. "Some hunger never dies." His words slithered into my ears, and for a brief second, I felt something deep in my chest, an instinctual fear, primal and absolute. The innkeeper rushed over, gently pulling the old man away. "Go back to your room," she said softly to me, her voice barely a whisper. I climbed the creaky stairs to my room, my heart still pounding. The room was small and musty, with faded wallpaper peeling at the corners. A single window overlooked the darkening cliffs. As night fell, the village seemed to retreat further into silence. The wind outside howled against the thin glass panes. and the faint sound of the sea crashing against the cliffs echoed in the distance. I pulled out my phone and checked the coordinates again. They weren't far, less than an hour's walk from where I was. I should have waited until morning. I should have let the growing dread in my chest stop me, but instead I packed my flashlight, a portable charger, and a few essentials into my backpack. I told myself I'd just check it out, just take a look at the cave entrance and come back before midnight. I couldn't turn back. Not yet. Transition. With the faint glow of my flashlight guiding the way, I stepped out into the cold Scottish night, heading towards the coordinates. The path to the cave wasn't marked on any map, just a faint trail winding down towards the jagged coastline, barely visible under the weak beam of my flashlight. The wind howled like a wounded animal, carrying with it the scent of salt, damp earth, and something else, something sharp and metallic. Blood. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it, that the stories and warnings were getting to me, but with every step closer to the mouth of that cave, the smell grew thicker, clogging my throat and making my stomach churn. The entrance appeared before me like an open wound carved into the face of the cliffs. The air was colder here, unnaturally so. My flashlight barely pierced the oppressive darkness inside. For a long moment, I stood there, just staring into the black void. I could turn back. I could walk away right now and no one would ever know. But I couldn't. Taking a deep breath, I crossed the threshold. Inside, the world narrowed to the beam of my flashlight and the sound of my own breathing, ragged and shallow. The walls were slick with moisture, and the faint drip, drip, drip of water echoed somewhere deep within. Every step I took felt impossibly loud, my boots crunching over gravel and something softer, something that cracked underfoot. Bone. I knelt down, aiming the light at the ground. A scattering of bones, small ones, finger-sized, lay half buried in the damp soil. Some still had remnants of tissue clinging to them, dark and shriveled. My stomach turned, but I forced myself to move forward. The deeper I went, the thicker the air became, heavy with decay and something else. Something stale, like the breath of a closed tomb. The walls weren't natural, not entirely. Alongside the natural rock formations, I began to notice markings, symbols carved deep into the stone, jagged and uneven, as if scratched by desperate, trembling hands. Some looked like eyes, others like mouths twisted in silent screams. Further in, I stumbled upon what looked like an old cooking pit, a shallow basin carved into the cave floor, blackened and cracked. Charred fragments of bone and ash filled the space, and beside it sat a rusted iron cauldron crusted with something dark. Human remains. These were human remains. I backed away, my flashlight trembling in my hand. A sound, faint, almost imperceptible, caught my attention. Whispers. Not words, not language, just sound. Faint, rasping, and constant, like a chorus of shallow breaths just beyond the edge of my light. I swung the beam around, scanning the walls, the floor, the ceiling. There was nothing there. It's just the wind, I told myself, just the wind moving through the tunnels. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Further into the cave, the passageway narrowed. The walls closed in on me, and I had to turn sideways to squeeze through in places. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. I could almost hear words. Hungry. Still hungry. Flesh. I froze. My breath hitched in my throat, and for a split second, I thought I heard breathing. Not mine. Slow, shallow inhalations, just a few feet behind me. I spun around, flashlight cutting through the dark. But there was nothing, just the damp walls and my own shadow trembling in the beam. I turned back and kept moving. Eventually, the passage opened up into a larger cavern. My flashlight illuminated a space that seemed lived in. Tattered blankets were strewn across the floor, makeshift bedding made from ragged cloth and moss. Rusty tools, knives, hooks, cleavers, lay scattered nearby, crusted with dark stains. And then I saw it. A crate pushed against the far wall. It was old, the wood rotting and splintered, but it was intact. Slowly, I approached and pried it open. Inside were several leather-bound journals, their covers damp and warped from the cave's humidity. The ink had run on most of the pages, smearing into illegible stains, but I could still make out some words. The hunger doesn't fade. The darkness keeps us alive. The light is poison. The flesh is salvation. We wait. We listen. We feed. My hand shook as I closed the journal. Whatever this was, it wasn't just legend. It was real. These weren't just stories passed down through time. Someone, or something, had written this. Then I noticed something else. Scratches on the stone floor beside the crate. Drag marks, deep and desperate, as if someone had been pulled across the ground, clawing for purchase. The whispers were growing louder now, almost deafening. They didn't seem distant anymore. They felt close. That's when I saw it. Deeper in the cavern, barely visible in the flickering light of my flashlight, a faint glow. It wasn't natural light, nor was it the cold blue-white of an LED or lantern. It was warmer, like candlelight. Someone or something was down there. For a moment, every instinct screamed at me to turn around and run, but my feet moved on their own, carrying me forward, step by hesitant step, deeper into the cavern. The light grew brighter as I approached, and I could make out shapes, silhouettes hunched over, shifting in the dim glow. They weren't moving like people. Their posture was wrong, their movements jerky and predatory. I ducked behind a rock formation and killed my flashlight, my breath caught in my throat. Slowly, I peeked out. There were 5 of them, gathered around a fire. Their skin was pale, almost translucent in the flickering light. Their limbs were thin, bony, their fingers impossibly long. They were muttering to each other in guttural whispers, heads twitching as if listening to something only they could hear. One of them suddenly froze and turned its head, slowly, deliberately, in my direction. Its eyes were pitch black, wide and unblinking. Its mouth, lined with jagged teeth, curled into something that resembled a grin. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I turned and ran. My flashlight flared back to life as I sprinted through the cave, my boots slipping on the wet stone. Behind me, I could hear them moving, skittering across the cave floor, their low whispers growing louder, more frantic. Fresh meat. Don't let it leave. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just ran, lungs burning, legs screaming with every step. Somehow, miraculously, I saw the faint light of the cave entrance up ahead. I burst into the open air, collapsing onto the damp grass outside. My chest heaved, and my body shook violently as the cold night wind bit into my sweat-soaked skin. But the whispers, they didn't follow me outside. Slowly, I turned back towards the cave entrance. The darkness inside seemed still, silent. But I could feel them, watching, waiting. Transition. I staggered back towards the village, haunted by the knowledge that whatever was in that cave, and it wasn't gone, and it wasn't done. I don't know how long I ran before my legs gave out. My flashlight flickered weakly, casting trembling light across the cave walls. The air was thick, almost suffocating, with the scent of rot and something sharp, something alive. I leaned against a slick rock wall, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely keep hold of the flashlight. That's when I noticed it, the change in the cave's layout. The narrow tunnel had opened into a larger chamber, a space too wide for my flashlight to fully illuminate. I panned the beam slowly across the cavern, and what I saw made my stomach turn. It looked lived in. There were matted piles of cloth and moss in corners, makeshift bedding that stank of mildew and sweat. Rusted tools lay scattered across the ground, knives, cleavers, hooks, all stained dark with something I didn't want to identify. In the center of the chamber sat a charred cooking pit surrounded by cracked bones and chunks of unidentifiable meat. but it was the carvings on the walls that froze me in place. Grotesque, elongated faces etched deep into the stone, their mouths open in eternal screams. Eyes hollow, bodies twisted in unnatural postures. Symbols I couldn't recognize were scratched between the faces, some still glistening as though they'd been freshly carved. This wasn't just a hideout. It was home, and I wasn't alone. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, something shifting in the shadows beyond my flashlight's reach. My body went rigid, my breath caught in my throat. Slowly, I turned the beam toward the far corner of the chamber. They were there. Figures crouched low to the ground, half hidden in the darkness. Their skin was pale and translucent, stretched tight over their skeletal frames. Their joints jutted out at sharp angles, their limbs impossibly long and thin. They weren't moving like people. Their heads twitched in tiny, jerky motions, their fingers tapping against the stone floor. But it was their eyes that paralyzed me. Wide, black, and unblinking, like bottomless pits staring straight through me. For a moment, neither of us moved. It was like time had frozen. The only sound was the faint drip of water somewhere in the distance and the erratic thumping of my heart in my chest. Then, one of them smiled. Its lips curled back to reveal a mouthful of jagged, uneven teeth, stained dark with something that gleamed wet in the flashlight beam. Its gums were raw, almost blackened. The creature let out a sound, a wet, rattling hiss that vibrated deep in its throat. The others shifted, their heads snapping up in unison as they turned toward me. And then, they moved. Not walking, not crawling, they skittered, their limbs carrying them across the ground in fast, erratic bursts. The sound of their nails scraping against stone filled the chamber like a chorus of insects. Instinct took over. I turned and ran. I could hear them behind me, claws scraping, teeth clicking, low guttural growls reverberating off the cave walls. My flashlight bounced wildly as I sprinted through the tunnels, barely avoiding jagged rocks and deep crevices in the ground. At one point, I glanced back just for a split second and saw them, their faces illuminated in flashes of light, their black eyes locked onto me, their twisted grins stretching impossibly wide. I turned a corner too sharply and slipped, crashing hard onto the stone floor. My flashlight flew from my hand, clattering somewhere into the darkness. Panic surged through me as I scrambled to my feet, my palms bleeding from where they'd scraped against the rock. In the faint glow of the flashlight, now several feet away, I saw one of them step into the light. Its head tilted slowly to the side, its mouth hanging open in that grotesque grin. Its fingers twitched, reaching toward me. I didn't think. I didn't breathe. I just ran. Somehow, through sheer adrenaline and blind luck, I spotted something up ahead. A faint glow. Not flashlight light, not firelight. Natural light. Moonlight. There was an opening in the rocks, a narrow crevice barely wide enough for a person to fit through. I threw myself toward it, squeezing my body into the gap. Jagged rocks tore at my clothes, my skin, but I pushed forward. Behind me, I heard them, closer now. Their growls turned into screeches, high-pitched and inhuman. Something grabbed my ankle, thin, bony fingers wrapping tightly around it. I kicked hard, my boot connecting with something soft. There was a sharp hiss and the grip loosened just enough for me to pull free. With one final push, I tumbled out of the crevice and onto wet grass. The cold night air hit me like a slap, filling my lungs with sharp, icy relief. For a long moment, I just lay there gasping, my body trembling from exhaustion and fear. But when I turned back to look at the crevice, it was empty. No faces staring out, no claws reaching for me. Just darkness. But I knew. They were still there, just beyond the edge of the light, watching, waiting. I staggered to my feet, my legs shaking beneath me, and stumbled back towards the village. I didn't stop to look back again. I couldn't. Transition. The village lights appeared on the horizon, flickering faintly through the mist. I thought I was safe, but as I would soon learn, the horrors of the Bean clan don't end at the cave's edge. The cannibal town of Sawney Bean, real horrors uncovered. I don't remember walking back to the inn. My feet moved on their own, my body running on fumes and blind instinct. The village was dead silent when I stumbled into the narrow streets, the faint glow of streetlights flickering like dying embers. When I reached my room, I slammed the door behind me, locked it, bolted it, and shoved a chair under the handle for good measure. My clothes were torn, stained with dirt and something darker. My hands were trembling so badly it took me 3 tries to light the rusted oil lamp on the nightstand. The flickering light painted grotesque shadows on the peeling wallpaper, and for a moment I thought I could still smell them. That awful scent of rot and copper. I dropped my backpack on the bed and yanked out my laptop, my fingers shaking as I powered it on. The faint hum of the fan spinning up was the only sound in the room. I had to understand. I had to know. I logged back into the same dark web forums I'd been on days before, fingers moving on autopilot as I navigated the maze of encrypted URLs and proxy servers. There, buried deep in an archived section of a conspiracy forum, I found it. The Eternal Hunger. The thread was sprawling, dozens of replies, grainy screenshots, and cryptic warnings scattered between paragraphs of rambling text. The users weren't casual browsers. They spoke in hushed, terrified tones, like survivors sharing war stories. Someone had posted coordinates. The same coordinates I had been given. Others had posted images, blurry, low-light photos of pale figures hunched in caves, black eyes reflecting light like predators in the dark. One post, time-stamped just a week before, read, "Do not go there. They are still alive. They are waiting." Another user replied beneath it, "It's not just the cave. They spread. The hunger spreads." My breath caught in my throat. My head spun as I scrolled further. Video links littered the thread, some dead, others still active. Against my better judgment, I clicked on one titled "Last Known Footage." The video loaded slowly, buffering over the weak Wi-Fi. It showed shaky, handheld footage of the cave, the same cave I had just crawled out of hours before. The camera moved erratically, light flickering over damp walls and jagged stone. In the background, there were faint whispers, inhuman, guttural. Then the camera turned. A pale figure stood just beyond the light, its black eyes locked onto the lens. Its mouth stretched impossibly wide into that familiar, grotesque grin. The screen glitched, and the feed cut out. My hands were ice-cold on the keyboard. I sat frozen for what felt like hours, the glow of the laptop screen the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. And then, my screen went black. Not a crash, not an error, just black. A chat window popped up. A single username appeared, HUNGER. My breath hitched. The first message appeared, "You shouldn't have gone there." Another message followed immediately after. "They've marked you now." My pulse thundered in my ears. I hesitated before typing back, "Who are you? What do you mean marked?" The reply came almost instantly. "They know you're sent. They know your face. You can't run." I slammed the laptop shut and shoved it away as if it might bite me. My chest felt tight, my breaths shallow. Outside my window, the faint sound of wind whistled through the narrow alleyways. But there was something else. A faint tap. Tap. Tap against the glass. I turned my head slowly, the dim oil lamp casting flickering light across the thin curtain. A silhouette stood just beyond the glass. Tall, motionless. The shape of its head tilted slightly, as if it was listening. I froze, not daring to breathe. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, unmoving, unblinking. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it raised one skeletal hand and dragged its nails down the glass. Screech. The sound made my teeth ache, and then it was gone. I bolted out of bed, yanking the curtains open. There was nothing there, just the empty alley, slick with rain and shrouded in darkness. But deep down, I knew it had been real. I couldn't sleep. Not after that. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the laptop. The glow of the screen felt intrusive, like an unwelcome guest in my room. Eventually, I reopened the laptop. The chat window was still there, the cursor blinking. What do I do? I typed. For a long while, nothing happened. I almost closed it again before one final message appeared. You can't escape hunger. You can only feed it, or let it feed on you. My stomach twisted into knots. I slammed the laptop shut again, my breaths coming in short gasps. I thought about the old man in the village, his warning, the symbols carved into the cave walls, the twisted faces staring at me from the dark. This wasn't just a story. It wasn't just a myth or an urban legend passed down through generations. The Bean clan wasn't gone. They weren't dead. They had survived. And now, somehow, they had reached out beyond their cave, through the dark web, through the quiet villages, through the shadows outside bedroom windows. And now, they knew me. Dawn eventually crept through the thin curtains, pale and weak against the grey Scottish sky. I stuffed my laptop back into my bag, grabbed whatever belongings I could, and stumbled out of the inn. The streets were empty. The villagers were gone, or maybe just hiding behind their curtains. I didn't stop walking until I reached my car. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from that place. But even now, days later, I can still feel them, watching, listening. Every shadow outside my window feels too still. Every creak of the floorboards feels too deliberate. And sometimes, when the night is quiet enough, I swear I can still hear it. A faint whisper. Hungry. Still hungry. Transition. I thought leaving the village would free me from them. But hunger, I've learned, is relentless. And it doesn't stop just because you've escaped the cave I left Scotland the next morning. I didn't check out of the inn. I didn't say goodbye to anyone in the village. I just packed my bag, threw it into the rental car, and drove until the coastal cliffs disappeared from the rearview mirror. But the feeling, it didn't leave me. That watching sensation, like eyes were pressed against the back of my skull, followed me onto the plane and lingered during the long flight home. The stale cabin air felt heavier than usual, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw those twisted faces staring at me from the dark corners of that cave. I returned to my apartment thinking I could leave it all behind. That distance would sever whatever connection I had to that nightmare, but it didn't. The emails started again 2 nights later. The first one had no subject, no message, just an attachment. It was a photo, a blurry image of my apartment building taken from across the street. The next email came with another photo. This time it was a picture of my bedroom window. My curtains were drawn, but I could see my silhouette faintly through the fabric. My chest tightened. I checked every lock on my doors and windows 3 times that night. The following evening, another email arrived. They're hungry again, and they know your scent. I slammed my laptop shut so hard the screen flickered. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I shoved the device into my backpack and stormed out of the apartment. I moved the next day. The next city brought no relief. At first, things were quiet. I changed my number, destroyed my old laptop, and avoided dark corners of the internet. But the silence felt wrong, like it was waiting to break. And then it did. A week later, a package arrived at my new apartment. There was no return address. Inside was an old, tattered leather journal, the same kind I'd seen in the cave. Scrawled across the first page in smeared ink were the words, "You can run, but you can't hide." I burned the journal in my kitchen sink that night, watching the ink bubble and smoke as the paper turned to ash. But the damage was already done. They knew where I was. I moved again. A smaller city, somewhere quiet, where no one asked questions and the neighbors minded their own business. But the whispers followed. At night, when everything was still and the only sound was the faint hum of my refrigerator, I'd hear them. Quiet, guttural murmurs seeping through the air vents, slipping through the cracks under the door. Fresh meat, still warm, still breathing. I stuffed towels under the doors. I kept the TV on at all hours to drown out the sound. But nothing worked. One night, I woke up to find muddy footprints smeared across my living room floor. They started at the front door and ended just below the vent in the corner of the room. I didn't sleep for 3 days after that. I tried to tell myself it wasn't real, that it was paranoia, guilt, some kind of psychological breakdown caused by what I'd seen in that cave, but it was real. The final confirmation came in the form of one last email. No subject, no text, just an image. It was a photo of me, taken through my bedroom window as I slept. The angle was impossible. It wasn't from the street or from another building. It was taken from inside the room. I stared at the photo until my vision blurred, my body frozen in place. There was nothing left to do, no locks to change, no city left to run to. I stopped sleeping after that. Every night, I'd sit in the corner of my living room with my back to the wall, staring at the vents, listening for the faintest sound. Sometimes I swear I can hear breathing, slow, shallow, just on the other side of the thin metal grates. Sometimes I hear faint footsteps in the hallway outside my door, stopping just beyond the threshold. And every once in a while, when the night is at its stillest, I hear it, a faint whisper, just loud enough to cut through the silence. Hungry. So hungry. I've thought about destroying this laptop, cutting off every connection I have to the internet, and disappearing completely. But deep down I know it won't matter. They've marked me. I don't think it's just about hunger, it's about something else, something ancient, something eternal. The Bean clan didn't die out in that cave. They adapted. They learned how to reach beyond their stone walls through cables and screens, whispers in the night, and photos in inboxes. Some legends aren't just stories, they're warnings. And sometimes curiosity doesn't just kill, it feeds. If you're listening to this, take it as your warning. If you ever find a thread online, a video feed, or a set of coordinates tied to Benain Cave, do yourself a favor. Close the tab. Delete the email. Forget you ever saw it, because if you don't, well, you might start hearing the whispers too, and when you do, it's already too late. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that some doors aren't meant to be opened. Some mysteries aren't puzzles to be solved, they're traps. It's so easy to dismiss warnings on the internet, a strange thread, a cryptic message, a link that feels like bait dangled in front of your curiosity. You tell yourself it's a joke, a hoax, just some messed up roleplay. But it's not. Sometimes the things we find online aren't meant for us. They're not games, not stories, not fiction. They're invitations. And once you've accepted, there's no walking away. That's what happened to me. I didn't realize the price of curiosity until it was too late. If you ever come across something, coordinates, a live stream, an encrypted message, that feels wrong, do yourself a favor. Don't follow it. Don't be like me, because there are places in this world that were never meant to be found, shadows that aren't empty, whispers that aren't just the wind, and some hungers. They never fade. But here's the real question. What would you have done? Would you have clicked the link? Would you have followed the coordinates? Would you have stepped into that cave, flashlight trembling in your hand, shadows pressing against you like a living thing? Or would you have slammed your laptop shut and walked away forever? I want to know. Would your curiosity have saved you or destroyed you? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me, what would you have done in my place? And if you made it this far, if you felt even a fraction of the dread that still keeps me awake at night, then you know what to do. Like the video, leave a comment, subscribe for more stories like this, because somewhere out there, in the forgotten corners of the world and the dark recesses of the internet, there are more stories like mine. And maybe, just maybe, you'll be the next one to find them. But be careful. Curiosity isn't just dangerous. Sometimes it's fatal.